Hello, lovers of the creepy. Today I want to share with you a new batch of disturbing, and, according to their authors, true, stories from Reddit. So, without further delay, let's get started. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, let's move on to the first story. Story 1. I worked in a nursing home as a hospice aide. One night, I had 3 patients who were actively dying, and my job was to make sure they were as comfortable as possible in their final hours. The girls I worked with on the night shift were amazing. We always tried to make each other laugh and somehow survive the night together. I was known for loving to scare them. Sometimes I would hide in a closet in a room where someone had recently passed away, the body and belongings already removed, the room empty. I'd press the call button and wait. The girls would rush in, quickly shut off the alarm, and then I'd jump out and scare them half to death. One night, I was sitting at the nurse's station, filling out paperwork. I had just administered narcotics to one of my patients when one of my aides came running in. She swore she had seen my shadow on the wall, like I was hiding there to scare her, but at the same time, she could hear my laughter coming from the nurse's station. I decided to check it out, because there shouldn't have been anyone else on our floor. When I went to the wall and stood where the light should have cast my shadow, there was nothing. I laughed it off. Then the aide started screaming. I turned around and saw a shadow rise up the wall out of nowhere. I just stared at it and said, "For the love of God, is that all you've got?" And I went back to the nurse's station. Some time later, I had to make rounds. When I approached one patient's room, I heard 3 knocks on the patio door next to it. I looked over and saw an elderly man dressed entirely in black. I couldn't let him in because I didn't have access to the patio, so I told him to wait while I got a nurse. When we came back, he was gone. The nurse went outside to check, but we found no one. So I continued my rounds and entered the patient's room. There was blood everywhere. The patient was on the floor, bleeding heavily. It looked like he had tried to get up, fallen, and thrashed around in his own blood trying to stand. The nurse moved him back to the bed, and we cleaned him up. There was nothing we could do, he had a DNR order. All we could do was keep him comfortable. I went to check on the next patient. He was dead. He had stopped breathing. I ran to get the nurse, grabbed his chart, he also had a DNR. We notified the morgue and his family, then the aide and I prepared his body. After that, I returned to the patient who had fallen. His vitals needed to be checked every 15 minutes because of the fall. He was dead too. I called the nurse again. She was upset. This situation had taken 2 aides away from her unit and added a lot of paperwork. As I walked down the hallway to get clean bedding, I saw the same elderly man, the one we had seen outside. He walked past the nurse's station and whispered, "Just one more, Jack, and I'm done for the night." The whisper was so horrifying that I jumped and ran after him. The door to a patient's room slammed shut. When I entered, the patient looked straight at me, gasped, and died. Her eyes were still staring directly into mine. For some reason, I noticed the window in her room was open. That struck me as strange. I ran to it, but saw nothing outside. I shut it, checked her pulse, there was none. It turned out the nurse had followed me. She saw everything I did. She heard the same voice. She swore she saw the man turn the corner, and then saw me run after him. She also saw the patient's door slam shut before I could get inside. When I turned around and saw the nurse standing in the doorway, all she could say was, "I saw it too. Oh my God. I saw it too." Story 2. I have another interesting story. Several years ago, I was attending university with a friend I'd known since school. We weren't best friends, but we got along well. We knew enough about each other to talk easily. I knew he was into spiritualism, and sometimes he talked about his spirit guide and things like that. It's not something I personally believe in, but to each their own. We were both hanging out in the dorm where I lived. He lived elsewhere. We were killing time, watching random junk on a small TV in the shared kitchen. We were waiting until 2 a.m., because that's when WWE, or WWF, as it was called back then, started. We didn't have Sky cable in the dorm, so we usually waited there, then walked to a local 24-hour pool hall that had Sky Sports. You could usually ask them to put wrestling on and turn up the volume. We were chatting about nonsense, watching something stupid on TV. I don't remember what we were talking about, but I know it wasn't anything creepy. We weren't drinking, we weren't on anything. Completely sober. When it was time to head out to catch the wrestling, we put on our jackets and kept talking as we stepped outside. And that's when something strange happened. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt cold. Not just chilly, a deep, penetrating cold that wrapped around me. It was around 2 a.m. in springtime in England, so yes, it wasn't warm. But this felt different. A chill ran down my spine. It might sound cliché, but the only way I can describe it is that slow-building dread you feel in a horror movie when the background music turns ominous. I tried to ignore it. But with every step down the street, the feeling grew stronger. The air felt heavy, like it was harder to breathe. I know this sounds like something straight out of a creepypasta, but it's the only way I can describe the terror settling in my gut. About a minute after we left the building, I suddenly realized we were both silent. We had been laughing and talking as we left the dorm, but the conversation had just died. I remember looking down the street, trying to figure out if maybe I was nervous because of suspicious people nearby. But the road was empty. The night was clear. Nothing unusual at all. And yet, in my head, an alarm was screaming. I was afraid of something, but I didn't understand what exactly. Finally noticing the silence, I just said, the air feels kind of heavy tonight." By that point my throat had gone completely dry. My friend looked at me, his face pale, and said, "Oh my God, you feel it too?" We tried to talk about what it could be, but it was difficult. The anxiety made us feel sick. Finally, when we crossed the road, I remember my friend turning even paler and saying, "It's death. There's death here." Strangely enough, I barely remember anything after we crossed the street. The terrifying feeling suddenly vanished, and we both laughed, even though we both had felt it. We made it to the pool hall, and I didn't think much about it for the next few days. Later that same week, I was walking back from university, this time alone, passing the building next to the dorm, on the very same road where my friend had felt death. There were 3 police cars and an ambulance outside. I watched in horror as 2 coroners carried out a body wrapped in a black bag. The next day, we found a story in the local newspaper. It turned out that 3 homeless people, trying to find shelter, had died inside that building. Their bodies had been there for several days before they were discovered and removed. We never found out what exactly they died from. After that, I never went to watch wrestling again. Another story. I work second shift in a hospital that about 90% of people consider haunted, and I'm part of that 90%. You see, every building, every floor, and almost every corner of this campus has its own creepy stories. I often work alone. I'm a janitor, which only makes things worse, at least when I start thinking about it. Usually, I try not to. My personal experience happened in the ultrasound department of the radiology clinic. By the time I get to that area, the lighting is dim, and there's nothing I can do about it. At night, it's always unsettling there, so I just do what needs to be done and move on. The area is shaped like the letter J, a long corridor that curves. On the inside of the curve is a locker room that opens into the mammography room and then loops back to the top of the J. If you stand at the bottom of the J, you can see the far end of the area through the doors of 2 rooms. I was standing there with a trash bag on my cart when something flickered in the corner of my eye. I looked up. Through the locker room and into the mammography area, I saw a figure. It had long hair, but it was definitely a man. I snapped out of my freeze and ran over to see if some strange person had wandered in. There was no one there. I grabbed my things and ran out without finishing my work, because screw that. The second floor, Matilda. Another story, not my own, is connected to the second floor of the hospital. The second floor contains only offices and computer labs. Everything is arranged along one long corridor that stretches the length of the building. On one end are the elevators, and on the other, double doors leading to the computer lab. This floor became known as the domain of an entity that staff affectionately call Matilda. The first story I heard about her came from a coworker who knew someone working on that floor. He had gone there for work and stayed late. As he left his office and headed toward the elevators, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye and turned toward the computer lab at the other end of the hall. He saw a figure that looked like a patient, a woman, peeking into the lab. He walked toward her and asked who she was and which floor she was from. She turned around. She had no face. The man froze, terrified. He wanted to run, but couldn't tear his eyes away from whatever was staring at him from the end of the corridor. Instead, he squeezed his eyes shut as hard as he could. Seconds passed, or minutes, he didn't know. When he opened them again, she was gone. He said he had never run so fast in his life. He ran straight out of the building without looking back. Another incident involving Matilda happened when one of the managers left a tape recorder running overnight in his second-floor office to capture strange noises or voices. The next day, I walked past his office with a coworker, and he called us in to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then a faint voice said, "Turn it off." It was chilling, bone-deep terrifying. This hospital from hell has countless stories, but I don't have time for more right now. I'd be happy to share more later. One more story. I'm back with another story. I'm actually at work right now, in this hospital from hell, and I remembered another incident. I'm currently in the MRI department, where my friend, let's call her Sandra, once experienced something horrifying. Like the ultrasound area, the MRI department can sometimes feel unsettling. Personally, I've never seen anything here, but as I mentioned, Sandra has. She told me that one night, she had to come in to prep the MRI machine. The area is shaped like a W. The center is the computer workstation, and on either side are the MRI rooms. On both sides of the workstation are windows looking into the MRI rooms, and in each window, you can see the reflection of the window behind you. That night, she was alone. She was setting up the machine, half asleep, when she began to feel that something was wrong. A growing sense of dread washed over her, so strong and oppressive that it fully woke her up. She looked up at the window facing one of the rooms and saw the silhouette of a figure standing in the corner. She couldn't make out what it was and assumed she might be imagining it. But then she remembered the reflections. The figure wasn't in the corner of the room. It was standing directly behind her. In the window behind her. Watching her. Final story. This is the story I mentioned at the beginning. It comes from this community and was posted relatively recently. So, here we go. This happened when I was in college. As I mentioned in my previous stories, that was a time in my life when a lot of creepy things were happening to me. I don't know what I was doing to attract so many strange people back then. Maybe I should have seriously reconsidered my life choices. Anyway. During college, I worked as a tutor at a school, but on weekends I sometimes babysat for family friends. One of the kids was old enough not to need a babysitter, let's call him Chris, but not old enough to watch his younger sibling, Kevin. So I was there that night. And honestly, it turned out to be absolutely terrifying. I don't know, maybe you won't find it as scary as I did at the time. We'll see. I was babysitting the kids one Saturday night. The parents usually didn't stay out late, they'd come home around 10 p.m. or even earlier when I watched the kids during their monthly date nights. But that night, there was something different. I honestly don't remember the exact reason anymore, but I was 19 at the time and old enough to stay up late. The parents said they'd be back by 1 in the morning and even offered to let me stay the night, but I had already decided that I wouldn't. There was something off about that house. It was isolated, surrounded by old buildings, a silo, sheds, a massive barn, and more. Maybe I had watched too many horror movies, but all I could think about was how many places someone could hide out there. On top of that, the house itself was very old. And old houses have always scared me. You know, ghosts. So staying the night was absolutely not happening. I was watching the kids when Kevin asked me to help him find something in the basement. He had a bunch of costumes he loved to wear. One time, he had scared the hell out of me by sneaking up on me in the dark dressed like some kind of ultra-American superhero, though of course, he wasn't actually one. That night, I nearly lost my mind. The basement was the second creepiest place in the house. The creepiest was obviously the attic, because attics are always terrifying. If he had asked me to go up there, it would have been an instant no. The basement wasn't fully finished. It was large, with lots of corners, turns, and corridors leading to different rooms. It was my first time going beyond the stairs, and I kept thinking that if I had known how scary this basement was, I never would have agreed to babysit in this house. But I didn't want to look weak in front of a kid. So I went with Kevin to his costume corner, which, of course, was deep in the basement. While Kevin searched for a costume, and I questioned every life decision that had led me there, we heard noises that could only be described as footsteps upstairs. At first, I said it had to be Chris. Then Chris suddenly appeared in the doorway, scaring me half to death. Seriously, I have no idea where he came from. He said, "It wasn't me." I remember that moment vividly. The three of us were standing next to a closet filled with all kinds of costumes, some of them genuinely creepy, in a small room in this sketchy basement, listening to what we thought were footsteps above us. So this is how we die, I thought, strangely accepting it almost instantly. That feeling lasted about 1 second. Then I thought, screw this, and started looking for a weapon. This is where watching too many horror movies actually helped. Of course, there was nothing useful. We were in a kid's playroom. The rest of the basement didn't have much either, just a washer and dryer, which would have been terrible weapons unless I somehow managed to shove them onto someone, which seemed unlikely. Eventually, I grabbed a random crowbar. Seriously. It was just lying on the floor. None of the kids knew why. I can't properly explain how ominous that basement felt. I braced myself to meet my fate, wondering how far I'd be willing to go to protect these kids. And that's when I realized something. The dog wasn't barking. The family had a golden retriever named Lily. She barked at everything. But she was silent. I started rationalizing the sounds as normal old house noises. Then I realized something else. When we heard the sounds, we weren't actually under the main part of the house. Based on where we were under the porch. So even if someone was there, they weren't inside the house. It could have been anyone, the most logical explanation being a delivery person. I felt a little better. But you can be damn sure I didn't put the crowbar down. Horror movies, again, they really prepare you for situations like this. We went upstairs and found Lily fast asleep. Not like she'd been knocked out, just completely passed out. She startled awake when I touched her because she was sleeping so deeply. For a moment, I actually thought she was dead, because that's just the kind of night it had been. Once upstairs, I went out onto the porch and carefully opened the door to check. Maybe there was a package. It was winter, and it gets dark early, so it wasn't impossible that a delivery person had come after sunset. But of course, there was nothing there. No package. And honestly, if that had been the end of it, I wouldn't be writing this. By that point, I was stressed. The kids had already gotten bored with everything and were playing video games, while I was Googling crime statistics for the town. Then Lily suddenly became alert and started barking like crazy. A second later, there was a knock at the door. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of loop that night. I grabbed the crowbar, went to the door, and saw through the frosted glass that someone was standing outside. I couldn't make out any features, but someone was definitely there. Since I'm not a complete idiot, I didn't open the door. Instead, I asked, "Who is it?" A man on the other side said he had a pizza delivery. You already know what I'm about to say. We didn't order pizza. This was before every kid had a phone, so the boys couldn't have ordered it. And honestly, they were so absorbed in their video games they were completely disconnected from reality. If the parents had ordered pizza, they would have told me. So naturally, I prepared to fight for my life again. Gripping the crowbar, I told him we didn't order pizza. I expected him to argue, to insist, to try to get me to open the door. But to my surprise, he didn't. He just said, "Oh, sorry, my mistake," turned around, and walked away. By that point, I had a lot of questions, like anyone would after a string of strange events in a creepy house in the middle of nowhere. So when I saw him walking off the porch through the frosted glass, I cracked the door open slightly. I wanted to get a look at him, just in case I ever needed to identify him. But by the time I opened the door, he was already walking away. I only saw his back. And immediately, I noticed two strange things. First, he wasn't holding any pizza. Second, I didn't see his car. I could maybe explain the car by assuming he parked on the street, which would have been odd considering they had a large horseshoe-shaped driveway, but still possible. But the lack of pizza? Technically, it could have been out of view, but I seriously doubt it. I almost called out to him in a burst of misplaced bravery. Then I realized that if I did, he'd know his plan had failed, and he'd have nothing to lose. So I shut the door and locked it. Later that night, Lily was unconscious again. The kids were asleep upstairs. I didn't think I would fall asleep. I swear, I sat there gripping that crowbar like I was preparing to fight for my life. Looking back, maybe it was an overreaction, but I wasn't about to be one of those idiots who dies because they underestimated a threat. I could have suggested the kids stick together, though that had basically already happened. They wouldn't have helped much anyway. Although Chris was 14. He was about my height. He could probably break a board with his fist. Maybe I should have kept him nearby. Eventually, I did doze off for about half an hour. I was woken up by the sound of an owl. I'm a very light sleeper, so either the hooting woke me, or it was just coincidence. But I definitely heard an owl when I woke up. The sound wasn't quite right. It sounded like an owl, but something about it was wrong. Looking back now, I realized that what I did next was incredibly stupid, considering everything that had happened that night. But I think my exhausted brain just wasn't working fast enough. Fatigue is the real killer in horror movies. In my exhausted state, I decided to figure out what was going on. I walked up to the door and started listening. The owl was still hooting, and it still sounded wrong. I couldn't understand why it felt so unnatural. And then I made another stupid decision. I opened the door. Once it was open, I could hear the owl more clearly. I shined my phone's flashlight into the darkness, keeping in mind this was 2007, so the light was terrible. Suddenly, I heard the owl again. And I swear, I gasped, because in that moment, everything clicked. That hooting sound wasn't a real owl. It was someone imitating an owl. Even now, telling this story, I get literal goosebumps. Maybe it doesn't sound that scary, but it was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I kept the weak beam of my phone pointed into the darkness, and that's when the light reflected off a pair of eyes. They were at human height. And remember, this was 2007. The flashlight was awful. which meant whoever those eyes belonged to was way too close. I couldn't see the person because of the darkness, but I was no longer tired. I snapped out of it instantly. I slammed the damn door shut, locked it, and barricaded myself in the living room after checking every first-floor window. Then I grabbed a massive kitchen knife, something straight out of a Michael Myers movie, because at that moment, I genuinely thought I might need it. I seriously considered calling the police. But what would I even say? Something outside is making owl noises and it has eyes? They'd tell me it was an owl, call me an idiot, and probably hang up. So instead, I sat on the couch, gripping the knife and the crowbar, trying not to think about all the horror stories I'd ever read or seen, especially the ones where kind babysitters meet horrible ends. That, of course, didn't work. I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, the parents finally came home. I texted them beforehand, trying to subtly warn them without outright admitting that I had completely lost my composure, which would have been an accurate description. I just said I heard something outside and asked them to be careful when they returned. They didn't take it seriously at all. They lived in some strange world where bad things never happen to good people. They walked in calmly while I hid the knife so they wouldn't see me clutching it like a shipwreck survivor clinging to debris. And then, that's when they casually mentioned that a couple of nights earlier, they had heard someone walking around outside. Because of course, that's not information you'd think to share with your babysitter ahead of time. Why would I need to know that, right? I took my money, fully earned, I swear, and rushed to my car to get the hell out of there. When I got home, I realized I still had the crowbar. And I won't lie, I never gave it back. You know, because of their critical failure to mention important information. I went through what was basically a real-life nightmare. So yeah. I earned that crowbar. That was the end of my babysitting career. I only watched their kids one more time, and that was because of a genuine medical emergency involving one of the parents. Thankfully, everything turned out fine, and I couldn't say no when they called me in desperation. Nothing scary happened that night, thank God, because I don't think I would have had the strength to go through that again. But even after all these years, there's one thing I'm 100% certain of. That was not an owl. And I think, I'll know. Sorry. Couldn't resist. That's all the stories for today, guys. Which one did you like the most? Personally, I loved the last one. It was the longest, the most entertaining, and just really interesting overall. Let me know what you thought about the video in the comments, and feel free to share your own creepy stories. Thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks, and see you later.